Honestly, the very first punch to my face didn't even completely shock me. It was actually the brutal second one, exactly when my arrogant dad violently drove his heavy knuckles straight into my fragile ribs. Exactly while my own mother just quietly stood there and calmly closed the living room curtains so the neighbors wouldn't see. And then came the third devastating blow, which landed right after he viciously hissed that I absolutely wasn't even worth keeping alive. My name is Emily Carter, I am 28 years old, and up until that horrific bloody night I genuinely, foolishly believed that even deeply broken families had some kind of natural limit. I naively thought that even highly cruel parents had a specific moral line they absolutely wouldn't ever cross with their own kid. Well, I violently found out just how incredibly wrong I was. This entire nightmare actually started exactly 3 weeks before that brutal beating, right when I suddenly learned I desperately needed to undergo an emergency medical surgery. This was absolutely nothing cosmetic, and it certainly wasn't optional. It was literally a life-saving medical procedure that would permanently prevent total organ failure if it was done in time. I nervously sat directly across from my toxic parents, my cold hands violently shaking in my lap, desperately thinking that maybe, just maybe, they would finally show me the basic parental love I had literally spent my entire miserable childhood desperately trying to earn from them. My dad didn't even bother to look up from scrolling on his expensive phone. He coldly asked exactly how much the procedure was going to cost him. I quietly whispered that it was $28,000. He aggressively scoffed, completely rolled his eyes, and casually told me that I should just go die somewhere cheaper. My mom slightly flinched in her expensive chair, but she absolutely didn't say a single word to defend my life. She honestly never did. I literally had zero personal savings to my name because their extreme financial control over my life was completely suffocating. I pathetically lived in their backyard guest house and actively worked for my dad's massive corporate company for a highly humiliating, incredibly low salary. And absolutely every single time I ever desperately tried to leave that toxic house, he aggressively reminded me of the massive fake debts he constantly claimed I legally owed him. That specific night, when I finally aggressively confronted them again, when I violently trembled and desperately cried that without this surgery I could literally drop dead, my dad completely exploded into a violent rage. He aggressively screamed that I was nothing but a pathetic financial investment that entirely failed to pay off for him. He called me a massive burden and completely useless weight dragging his life down. But exactly when he violently grabbed my bruised arm to aggressively drag me outside into the cold, my mom finally stepped right forward. She absolutely didn't step up to physically stop him from hurting me, but rather to coldly warn him not to do it out front in front of the wealthy neighbors, explicitly telling him to just take me back inside to finish it. The entire world violently tilted on its axis in that moment. My own biological mother, my absolute last tiny shred of hope on this earth, was actively trying to frantically protect his pristine public reputations instead of protecting my actual life. My dad violently shoved me incredibly hard against the drywall, aggressively yelling that I just desperately wanted unearned attention, and falsely claiming that I literally fabricated all my severe medical symptoms just for cheap pity. The brutal beating came incredibly fast and profoundly cruel, just an absolute violent blur of heavy fists and hard leather boots. My mom just quietly stood there and watched the entire assault in total silence. Her breathing was completely steady, and her cold eyes were entirely blank. When he finally violently kicked me directly toward the heavy front door and aggressively shouted for me to get the hell out and never come back, unless I was either dead or profusely sorry, I literally tasted thick copper blood in my mouth and felt something significantly colder wash over me. It was pure, unadulterated clarity. I pathetically staggered out into the freezing night air, tightly clutching my throbbing ribs, my vision incredibly blurry from the tears, feeling completely heartbroken, but my mind was finally rapidly awakening from a decades-long coma. Something incredibly deep inside me permanently shifted, violently hardened, and perfectly sharpened into a lethal weapon. Because exactly in that horrific moment, I actively realized something incredibly terrifying and deeply freeing. They completely believed I absolutely didn't have the mental strength to possibly survive the real world entirely without them. They were absolutely about to violently learn exactly how incredibly wrong they were, and exactly how massively expensive that arrogant mistake would actually be for them. But hey, real quick, before I tell you exactly how I systematically destroyed their entire toxic empire, make sure you smash that subscribe button right now if you absolutely love seeing arrogant abusers get the exact brutal karma they deserve. So anyway, I obviously didn't go straight to the local hospital that night. I literally couldn't go. My dad had already maliciously cancelled my health insurance plan months earlier strictly to cut out what he called unnecessary business expenses, and I only tragically discovered his betrayal when the ER completely refused to admit me without a massive upfront cash payment. So instead of getting help, I painfully limped directly to the absolute only safe place I could even think of, which was my incredibly old car. It was a heavily rusted blue sedan that my dad absolutely refused to let me legally sell because he claimed driving a piece of junk actively kept me from getting too cocky in life. I painfully slid right into the torn driver's seat, my broken ribs aggressively throbbing, my swollen eyes deeply stinging, and for the absolute first time in 28 years, the heavy silence inside that car felt entirely honest. There were absolutely no fake apologies, zero guilt-tripping, absolutely no toxic manipulation, just pure physical pain and the brutal truth hiding right beneath it. My toxic parents had absolutely never genuinely loved me. They strictly loved total control, and I had simply been entirely too desperate for tiny scraps of fake affection to ever clearly see the truth. Growing up in that mansion, my dad actively treated me significantly less like an actual daughter, and entirely more like a pathetic unpaid corporate intern. Every single household chore was strict training for his company. Every single good grade I got was completely expected, never praised. And absolutely every single failure, whether it was completely real or entirely imagined in his head, was treated like a massive personal insult to his fragile ego. My mom smoothly operated exactly like his quiet, invisible shadow, always physically present in the room, but absolutely never actively resisting his cruel demands. She brutally taught me incredibly early in life that parental love was highly conditional. Basic affection had to be heavily earned through obedience, and actual survival simply meant staying completely silent. Whenever I foolishly dreamed of finally moving out of that house, my dad aggressively dangled fake opportunities in front of my face that were honestly nothing more than psychological traps. He gave me a dead-end job at his company with absolutely zero chance for career advancement. He gave me a small room in the backyard guest house that he constantly called rent-free, but he actively monitored it exactly like a maximum security prison. He gave me a rusted car that I absolutely couldn't legally sell because he strictly kept his own name on the official title. Absolutely every single part of my entire adult life existed firmly trapped right under his heavy thumb. And right now, exactly when I desperately needed his help the absolute most just to stay alive, he explicitly chose brutal violence over basic compassion, total control over simple humanity, and his massive ego completely over my own life. But here is exactly what those toxic monsters absolutely didn't know about me. Exactly while my arrogant dad spent years constantly reminding me that I was an absolute nobody, I had quietly been in the background learning absolutely everything about his life. I intimately knew exactly how his sketchy business actually worked. I knew exactly where his massive financial vulnerabilities were securely hidden. I knew exactly which board members secretly despised him entirely behind closed doors, and I knew exactly what dark secrets my mom desperately hid from him just to keep the peace. I honestly never originally intended to ever actually use any of that highly damaging information against them, but absolute desperation has a really funny way of completely rearranging your sense of mercy. I quietly sat in that freezing cold car, violently trembling, desperately scrolling through my phone with incredibly shaky fingers, obsessively checking my terrifying medical test results over and over again. The emergency surgery was absolutely needed incredibly soon, literally a matter of days, not months. My toxic parents had explicitly refused to help me live, but there were definitely other viable options out there, and there were highly connected people actively watching from the shadows. Specific people who legally owed me massive favors. People my arrogant dad absolutely never even knew I had quietly helped in the past. People who genuinely hated his guts significantly more than I ever even realized. My bruised ribs violently screamed in pure agony exactly when I slightly leaned back against the seat. But a highly electrifying new thought violently cut straight through the physical pain, incredibly sharp and terrifyingly clear. If my toxic parents desperately wanted me entirely gone so badly, maybe it was officially time I completely disappeared from daily lives and magically reappeared exactly where it would financially hurt them the absolute most. A sudden vibration violently buzzed right in my cold hand. It was a cryptic text message from someone I absolutely hadn't spoken a single word to in over 5 years. The message simply read that he had heard exactly what just happened, telling me to meet him tomorrow morning because we desperately needed to talk. My breathing completely caught in my throat, because that specific sender was literally the absolute last person on earth my parents ever wanted anywhere remotely near me. I barely slept a single wink that night in the car. Every single inhale violently burned my lungs. Every single exhale caused my body to violently tremble. By the very next morning, I looked exactly like a walking ghost covered in dark purple bruises. But that text message just kept aggressively flashing right in my mind. Meet me tomorrow. The actual sender's name was completely impossible for me to ignore. It was Daniel Brooks, my dad's highly successful former business partner, the exact man my dad had brutally publicly humiliated, entirely financially ruined, and then maliciously framed for corporate embezzlement strictly to save his own pristine reputation from a massive scandal. Daniel had absolutely always been incredibly kind to me growing up. Honestly, he was entirely too kind according to my paranoid dad, who aggressively accused me of being highly ungrateful absolutely every single time Daniel simply showed me pure decency. Exactly when Daniel completely disappeared right after the massive fake scandal broke, I logically assumed he had permanently moved states, or maybe even fled the country, but he actually hadn't left at all. He had been quietly watching from the shadows this entire time, and right now he desperately wanted to talk to me. I painfully drove my rusted car directly to the small local cafe we constantly used to meet at back when he actively mentored me during my brief, failed attempt to escape my dad's toxic company years ago. The cafe was completely empty except for him sitting in the corner, looking significantly older, incredibly sharper, and carrying the specific kind of dead calm that only comes from completely surviving absolute hell. His eyes violently widened in pure shock the exact second he clearly saw my heavily bruised face. He angrily snapped, asking if my dad had finally lost his mind, and completely snapped on me. I heavily swallowed the lump in my tight throat. I quietly told him that my dad completely refused to pay a single dime for my emergency surgery. Daniel slowly leaned back in his wooden chair, his entire expression aggressively darkening with pure rage. He coldly stated that of course my dad did that, because absolutely anything my dad cannot fully control, he violently destroys. Actually, hearing someone else say that brutal truth completely out loud made something incredibly heavy inside my chest completely crack wide open. For the absolute first time in years, I absolutely didn't feel completely crazy anymore. I finally felt genuinely seen. Daniel aggressively tapped his fingers on the table. He leaned in and whispered that he had kept his mouth completely shut for 5 long years, but he explicitly still had absolutely every single hidden file, every single secret audio recording, and every single deleted email my father aggressively used to unfairly bury him. He leaned even closer and cold stated that he knew exactly where my dad's empire was currently the most vulnerable. My heart violently pounded in my chest. I desperately asked him exactly why he was telling me all this highly classified information now. He looked me dead in the eye and stated it was entirely because I was the absolute only person on earth my dad had massively underestimated. The one person he arrogantly thought he had completely broken into submission. His voice dropped incredibly low as he brutally added that it was also because I was actively dying, and my own father absolutely didn't care at all. The brutal truth hit my system exactly like freezing ice directly in my veins. Daniel absolutely wasn't offering me pathetic sympathy. He was actively offering me a loaded weapon. But right before I could even open my mouth to respond to his offer, the front cafe door violently opened and my stomach completely dropped to the floor. My mom casually walked right in. Her cold eyes rapidly scanned the quiet room until they immediately landed dead on me, sitting directly across from the exact man my dad hated the absolute most in the world. She completely froze in her tracks. I entirely froze in my seat. Then her thin lips slightly parted in a highly toxic whisper that was sharp enough to easily slice through solid bone, desperately asking me what the hell I had just done. Her manicured hand immediately reached deeply into her expensive designer purse. She absolutely wasn't reaching for her phone, and she wasn't reaching for her car keys. It was for something significantly more dangerous. For a terrifying split second, I literally couldn't breathe. My mom's hand dipped even deeper into the leather purse, and Daniel's entire body violently tensed up, exactly like he absolutely already knew exactly what toxic move was coming next. Then she aggressively pulled it straight out. It absolutely wasn't a physical weapon. It was a tiny silver digital camera that she explicitly used for strictly one highly toxic purpose, which was actively collecting blackmail evidence for my dad to maliciously twist against people. She immediately raised it right up to her face, the bright white flash violently exploding completely across the dim cafe. Click, click, click. Every single mechanical shutter sound actively felt exactly like another sharp knife brutally carving directly into my skin. I desperately lurched forward over the table, my broken ribs violently screaming in pain, begging her to stop it. She absolutely didn't stop. She just aggressively kept taking more pictures, her toxic voice completely dripping with icy, sickening satisfaction. She coldly stated that I literally had one simple job in life, which was to stay completely away from this ruined man. Daniel immediately stood right up from his chair. He firmly commanded Linda to stop this madness right now. She viciously snapped right back at him, aggressively demanding that he absolutely never speak to her, actively stepping away from him exactly like he carried a highly infectious disease. She coldly stated that her arrogant husband was entirely right about him being pure poison, and maliciously added that now I was completely infected by him too. The entire room violently spun around me. It absolutely wasn't from the physical pain anymore. It was entirely from a deep, profound betrayal so massive it completely rattled something ancient right inside my bones. My mom slowly turned her cold eyes back to me. She smugly asked if I honestly thought my dad refusing my life-saving surgery was incredibly cruel. She aggressively gestured directly at Daniel, and then pointed directly at me, coldly stating that this specific picture would absolutely kill my dad significantly faster than my pathetic little medical condition ever could. She slowly leaned right in, toxically whispering so incredibly low that only I could possibly hear her, stating that maybe me dying was honestly for the zest anyway. I blindly stared at her in pure horror, staring directly at the exact same woman who used to gently tuck me in at night, who used to softly braid my hair before school, who constantly smiled so perfectly in our fake family pictures exactly while secretly hiding dark purple bruises of her own, the exact woman who actively chose to live in pure fear completely over love absolutely every single time. But honestly, this absolutely wasn't just fear anymore. This was toxic, twisted loyalty. Completely blind loyalty strictly to a monster who actively valued his fake public reputation significantly more than his own daughter's life. Daniel's jaw violently clenched in anger. He firmly told Linda that I only came to him today because I desperately needed emergency medical help, reminding her that her psycho husband literally nearly put me in the hospital last night. My mom just casually shrugged her shoulders with zero empathy. She coldly replied that if I had just blindly listened to his strict rules, he absolutely wouldn't have ever needed to physically touch me. That specific word, needed, completely shattered the absolute last remaining piece of hope inside my soul. I slowly stepped back away from her and then took another heavy step. The cafe suddenly felt entirely too suffocatingly small, the air felt incredibly heavy, and my mother's dead eyes were entirely too calm. She continued speaking, her toxic voice incredibly cool and highly practiced. She explicitly ordered me to come right back home immediately, demanding that I pathetically apologize to my abuser, and forcefully commanded me to completely destroy absolutely any remaining connection I still had with Daniel. She slowly lifted the silver camera right back up, explicitly threatening that if I didn't completely obey her, these pictures would immediately go exactly where they needed to go to destroy my life. It was a blatant threat, a toxic promise, and a massive legal noose wrapping right around my neck. She confidently turned around to finally leave, but right at the doorway, she completely paused, looking directly over her shoulder with highly chilling, absolute certainty. She coldly stated that I absolutely could not possibly survive the real world without their money, aggressively warning me not to deeply embarrass myself by even trying. The heavy glass door violently closed right behind her, the bells aggressively chiming exactly like a depressing funeral march. I just stood there completely frozen in shock. Daniel slowly exhaled a heavy breath. He quietly told me that they had absolutely just officially declared a massive war against us. And honestly, for the absolute first time that entire horrific day, I actively felt something incredibly dangerous rapidly rise up inside my chest. I completely refused to cry when my toxic mom left the cafe. I absolutely didn't collapse on the floor, I didn't pathetically plead for mercy, and I absolutely didn't let the massive panic entirely swallow me alive, exactly the pathetic way it constantly used to. Instead, absolutely everything inside my head went completely, terrifyingly quiet. A highly perfect, lethal quiet. Daniel nervously watched my face incredibly carefully. He gently asked me to talk to him, desperately wanting to know exactly what dangerous plan was currently forming in my head. I firmly pressed my shaking hand directly against my heavily bruised ribs, inhaled an incredibly slow, painful breath, and finally confidently said the exact words I had absolutely never previously allowed myself to even think out loud. I coldly stated that I was officially permanently done trying to merely survive their abuse, declaring that the absolute only way to truly survive this was to completely outsmart them and destroy them. Daniel slowly nodded his head, exactly as if he had been patiently waiting for 5 long years just to hear me finally say those exact words. So, we immediately drove straight to his secure office, which was a highly private, incredibly small workspace securely hidden right above an old dusty bookstore, completely quiet and entirely off the grid. Once we got safely inside, he quickly unlocked a heavy metal drawer and firmly slapped an incredibly thick legal folder right down on the table. He aggressively tapped the folder and proudly announced that this specific file contained absolute undeniable proof of every single highly illegal corporate transaction my arrogant father ever made in the 5 years right before he maliciously ruined Daniel's life. My breath completely hitched in my throat. The folder was heavily packed with deleted corporate emails, secret audio recordings, massive offshore bank transfers, heavily manipulated tax records, undeniable proof of severe employee mistreatment, and massive legal documents clearly showing he had actively stolen massive amounts of company money straight through completely fake shell vendors, explicitly including one massive fraudulent account secretly registered entirely under my own mother's name. I was absolutely not emotionally prepared to see her name on that paper. I quietly whispered that she had actually actively helped him steal the money. Daniel deeply hesitated for a second before brutally clarifying that she absolutely didn't just passively help him, she explicitly legally signed off on completely half of the massive fraud herself. My tight chest violently tightened in an entirely new, deeply sickening way. My mom absolutely wasn't a helpless victim of his abuse. She absolutely wasn't trapped in that mansion. She was actively a highly willing, highly calculating architect of the exact same monster who entirely destroyed both of our lives. I blankly stared down at the massive pile of hard evidence, actively thinking about all the innocent lives my toxic parents had completely crushed just to aggressively protect their fake corporate empire. I stared directly at their bold signatures, the heavily forged legal dates, the highly cruel business strategies totally disguised as normal corporate decisions. Then a massive thought completely surfaced in my brain, incredibly sharp, highly strategic, and fiercely deliberate. I completely realized that I absolutely didn't actually need to publicly expose them just yet. I actively needed them to accidentally expose themselves first, strictly because my arrogant father was incredibly predictable and massive arrogance always creates massive blind spots. I quietly murmured that he entirely thinks I am incredibly weak. I stated that he genuinely thinks I will pathetically crawl right back home and literally beg him for the surgery money. Daniel completely agreed, stating that my dad would absolutely expect me to show pure fear. I smiled a cold smile and stated that was exactly why I was going to gladly give him something completely different. I slowly lifted the heavy folder off the desk and confidently stated that I was going to give him absolute silence. Daniel's eyebrows violently shot right up in total confusion, asking exactly what radio silence would actually get me in this situation. I confidently told him it would buy me massive time. I straightened my posture, the physical pain completely dulling out my rapidly racing mind now entirely blazing with strategy. I coldly pointed out that he violently kicked me out of the house, which legally meant I was officially absolutely no longer his financial dependent. I stated that he aggressively wanted me entirely gone, so that was absolutely perfect. I was going to completely disappear off the face of the earth. Absolutely no phone calls, 0 text messages, and absolutely no digital trace left behind. Daniel nervously asked exactly what I was planning to do in the meantime. I slowly opened the massive folder right back up and coldly stated that I was going to quietly build, strictly document, and heavily prepare for war. My voice slowly dropped into something significantly colder than basic revenge. I explicitly promised that exactly when I was finally entirely done with them, they absolutely wouldn't just simply lose some money. They would completely lose absolutely everything they valued, including their fake reputation, their massive mansion, their corrupt company, their fake wealthy friends, and their entire legal safety net. Daniel slowly exhaled a deep breath, looking incredibly impressed by my shift. He proudly stated that I was actively thinking significantly bigger than just simple punishment. I completely agreed, stating that I was actively thinking about pure justice. But true justice absolutely needed exactly one more highly specific ingredient to perfectly work. I desperately needed a completely invisible digital way right back directly inside my dad's massive corporate network, quietly operating completely undetected strictly through the exact same secure systems he arrogantly thought he fully controlled. An incredibly slow, lethal smile perfectly curved directly on my lips. I confidently told Daniel that I knew exactly how to easily bypass his entire firewall. The absolute very first step to entirely destroying a highly arrogant man, exactly like my toxic father, absolutely wasn't just publicly exposing his crimes. It was actively letting his massive ego firmly believe he had absolutely already won the war. So, I completely vanished into thin air. Absolutely no phone calls, zero text messages, and I permanently deleted all my social media. My cell phone strictly stayed completely powered off, except for the 3 specific people who actually genuinely cared whether I lived or died, which was Daniel, my personal doctor, and a highly aggressive corporate lawyer Daniel quickly introduced me to. Meanwhile, my dad completely spiraled out of control exactly as I perfectly predicted he would. Exactly 3 days right after I entirely disappeared, Daniel quickly forwarded me a highly aggressive voicemail. My dad had furiously left a message directly on Daniel's old business line. He viciously screamed into the phone that if I ever dared to contact him, Daniel needed to explicitly tell me my life was permanently finished. He arrogantly bragged that I absolutely wasn't stepping a single foot back inside his company ever again, loudly claiming he had permanently completely cut off my digital access to absolutely everything in the building. Access. That was the exact specific word that instantly made me smile from ear to ear. Because my arrogant dad absolutely didn't know the one massive digital secret I had carefully always kept entirely hidden from him. Years ago, right before he maliciously demoted me to pushing basic paperwork and grabbing coffee, I actively worked briefly in his corporate IT department. I worked there exactly long enough to deeply understand his entire internal network structure and exactly long enough to permanently memorize one massive, completely unchangeable security weakness. My dad's entire corporate network actively used an incredibly outdated legacy software program firmly protected by old passwords he absolutely refused to ever update, explicitly including the massive financial management system. And exactly guess who absolutely still had a highly active, totally hidden old login securely tied directly to that system? Me. My dad arrogantly thought he entirely revoked my system access. He absolutely didn't know a single thing about the highly secure backup access the lead IT guy secretly created entirely for me right after my dad brutally screamed at me in the office until I publicly cried. I confidently logged directly into the corporate network entirely from Daniel's secure private office. The massive system screen instantly loaded up, clearly displaying absolutely every single department, every single financial transaction, every massive offshore shell account, and every single highly fraudulent fake vendor. Daniel leaned right over my shoulder in pure shock. He quietly asked me if I fully realized exactly what massive power I currently had right here. I quietly murmured that I absolutely did, but I absolutely didn't instantly drain his bank accounts. I absolutely didn't maliciously delete any important files. I absolutely didn't even touch a single dime of the money at all. I actively did something significantly smarter and infinitely more permanent. I silently mirrored absolutely everything on the server. Every single highly illegal money transfer was perfectly duplicated. Every single heavily forged legal signature was flawlessly recorded. Every single fake vendor account directly linked to my mom's name was neatly completely copied directly into a highly secure, heavily encrypted folder that was perfectly timestamped, completely backed up, and entirely unalterable by anyone. Then I systematically set up a highly complex scheduled auto-transfer program, absolutely not for moving money, but for massively moving highly classified information. If my toxic parents even so much as desperately tried to physically track me down, violently threaten me again, or maliciously file any fake legal charges against me, these exact files would instantly automatically forward directly to the federal IRS, the state attorney general, the Department of Labor, the exact two investigative journalists my dad heavily despised, and his absolute biggest corporate competitor. It was a flawless, lethal dead man's switch. Daniel just blindly stared at me, exactly like he had literally just personally witnessed fire being invented for the first time. He breathlessly whispered that this plan was completely brilliant. I softly corrected him, stating that this absolutely wasn't the actual revenge just yet. This was merely just my legal insurance policy. The massive revenge was officially coming next. The exact moment my paranoid dad finally realized something was highly wrong with his corporate network, he would violently come looking for answers. He would easily blindly believe whatever my mom said. He would instantly heavily blame Daniel, but he would absolutely never see me aggressively coming for him because I absolutely wasn't trying to destroy him entirely from the outside. I was absolutely already firmly planted directly inside his massive empire. Quietly, methodically tightening absolutely every single loose screw until the entire corrupt structure completely collapsed right under its own massive weight. And exactly tomorrow morning, the massive collapse would officially begin. The brutal collapse absolutely didn't start with loud police sirens or massive news headlines. It simply started with a single phone call. It absolutely wasn't a call to me, it was directly to my mom. Daniel actively played the intercepted voicemail completely out loud for me, the phone speaker sitting directly on the table right between us. My dad's voice was incredibly strained, heavily angry in a highly specific, terrifying way that absolutely only ever happened when he completely lost total control of a situation. He viciously barked into the phone, desperately demanding to know exactly where Linda was hiding. He frantically screamed that the federal corporate auditors had just aggressively showed up entirely unannounced at the office. He yelled that they were aggressively asking highly specific questions about massive fake vendor accounts he claimed he had absolutely never even heard of. He viciously screamed that her specific name was officially listed on completely half of the fraudulent files, furiously demanding to know exactly how the hell her name got directly attached to them. My mom's pathetic voice was incredibly muffled and highly panicked. She frantically stammered that she absolutely didn't know anything about it, desperately suggesting that maybe it was just a massive computer glitch. A glitch. My dad violently roared into the phone that the federal IRS absolutely doesn't do computer glitches. He screamed that someone was actively inside his highly secure system, entirely mirroring all his illegal transactions, claiming it was someone who knew exactly where to specifically look to destroy him. Daniel quickly glanced over at me with a smirk. I just stayed completely quiet and listened. My dad furiously continued, his voice violently dropping right into that terrifyingly cold whisper that consistently used to entirely freeze my childhood in pure fear. He coldly commanded her to instantly find Emily right now, screaming that he absolutely didn't care exactly how she did it. He aggressively declared that I was 100% the one behind this massive attack. My mom sharply inhaled in pure panic. She desperately tried to argue, claiming I was absolutely way too weak and far too sick to pull this off. He violently snapped at her to absolutely never defend me again. Something incredibly heavy violently slammed in the background of the audio, probably his heavy fist violently smashing against his expensive mahogany desk. He viciously screamed that I absolutely did this to them, claiming I desperately wanted to entirely destroy their lives, and angrily yelled that he absolutely should have thrown me out on the street years ago. The frantic call abruptly ended with the violent sound of expensive glass violently breaking against a wall. I actively felt absolutely nothing. Zero fear, zero guilt, just a highly quiet, incredibly steady, ironclad resolve. My desperate mum frantically tried to call my dead phone next, then aggressively flooded my inbox with texts, and finally left a pathetic voicemail. She desperately fake cried into the phone, sweetly calling me darling, completely lying and saying they just desperately wanted to sit down and talk. She claimed my father was just under a lot of extreme corporate stress, begging me to just come right back home so we could magically fix absolutely all of this together as a family. She desperately pleaded with me not to do anything highly stupid, her voice violently trembling with pure terror. But honestly, it absolutely wasn't genuine worry for my safety at all. It was entirely pure for their crumbling empire. The exact same empire I had literally spent years of my life desperately helping them unfairly uphold. The toxic empire they aggressively built entirely on deep fear, massive lies, and my absolute blind obedience. Daniel slowly looked right at me. He softly stated that they were completely panicking now, explicitly declaring that this was officially the perfect moment to strike. He asked me exactly what I desperately wanted to do next. I heavily swallowed, actively feeling the massive, suffocating weight of 28 long years violently pressing right against my ribs. Absolutely not the physically broken ones, but the deep, invisible psychological ones. I quietly whispered that I desperately wanted them to finally fully understand exactly what it truly feels like to completely lose all control, to feel entirely powerless, and to be brutally discarded like garbage. Daniel slowly nodded his head. He quietly stated that it was officially time to end this. We absolutely didn't even actually need to personally break the massive company ourselves. We literally just needed to slightly open the door and let the brutal truth naturally surface on its own, and the toxic truth was absolutely already rapidly spreading exactly like a massive wildfire. By that exact same evening, 3 different terrified employees had already completely anonymously emailed Daniel, frantically claiming my paranoid dad had aggressively interrogated them in his office, violently accusing absolutely everyone of being corporate traitors. One guy explicitly claimed my dad had completely violently smashed a computer monitor in a blind rage. Another employee desperately said my mum had been pathetically crying alone in her luxury car for over an hour. A third person frantically reported that the federal agents had aggressively visited the main office again, this time explicitly armed with significantly more demanding questions. The massive cracks in their perfect facade were rapidly widening by the second, and exactly tomorrow morning, I was absolutely going to permanently finish exactly what they originally started, exactly when they violently beat me, brutally bruised me, and coldly abandoned me to die in the street. Because honestly, the absolute final, devastating blow absolutely wasn't the leaked files, it absolutely wasn't the public exposure, and it absolutely wasn't just basic revenge. It was exactly the moment of me confidently walking right straight through their massive front door, completely alive, entirely unbroken, and firmly holding the absolute truth they arrogantly thought I would absolutely never have the mental strength to actually use against them. I confidently arrived directly at my toxic parents' massive house at exactly 9 a.m. sharp. I absolutely didn't go to the tiny guest house. I absolutely didn't use the hidden back door, and I absolutely wasn't pathetically sneaking inside exactly like a highly frightened, abused child anymore. I proudly walked straight right up the main front steps and aggressively rang the doorbell. My mom slowly opened the heavy door, and absolutely all the blood instantly completely drained right out of her pale face. Her voice violently cracked in pure shock as she breathlessly whispered my name, completely stunned that I was actually still alive. I confidently stepped right inside the grand foyer completely without waiting for her fake permission. Deeply disappointed, she violently flinched back, but I absolutely didn't slow down for a single second. I aggressively walked straight directly into the main living room, exactly where my dad nervously stood, entirely hunched over massive stacks of federal legal documents, his eyes entirely bloodshot red. His expensive tie was heavily loosened, and his perfect hair was completely disheveled in panic. He completely froze exactly like a statue when he clearly saw me standing there. For one incredibly long, highly thick, suffocating moment, absolutely no one in the room even dared to breathe. Then he just looked at me and said exactly one single, highly venomous word, calling me you, clearly showing that for the first time in his life he was entirely, utterly afraid of me. And if you absolutely loved hearing how I legally destroyed my toxic parents' empire, hit that subscribe button right now for more daily revenge stories.